So back in 2024, researchers did this fascinating quasi-experiment. They took a group of people and randomly assigned them to work on a simulated rice farm.
Oh, yeah, the water flow coordination study.
Right. They had to coordinate water flow, manage crops, all of that. And within a surprisingly short amount of time, their actual measurable psychology shifted. They became demonstrably more collectivist in their thinking.
It's pretty wild how fast it happened.
It really is. And the control group, the ones assigned to farm wheat independently, they remain deeply individualistic. So, have you ever wondered why some countries seem to run perfectly on unspoken rules and good vibes, while others require strict written laws for literally everything?
Or why some cultures are deeply collectivist while others are fiercely individualistic. We always assume it's just, a choice.
Exactly. But today, we are looking at how the dirt you stand on, the weather you endure, and the invisible threats around you are secretly writing the software of your brain. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It fundamentally challenges how we think about human societies. We tend to assume that different cultures are the result of conscious choices.
Right, like they held a meeting or something.
Yeah, like a population sat down at some point and decided on their moral priorities. But we're looking at a sweeping essay by Elias Kunis today called The Environment is the Author.
And the mission of this deep dive is to look past this comforting idea of cultural choices and decode the actual source code of civilizations. Kunis presents this highly specific causal chain.
Which is really the foundational framework of the whole essay.
Right. He argues that environment creates selection pressure, which then shapes psychology, and then that psychology constrains institutions, which finally produce what we proudly call our values.
That causal chain is the key to everything we are going to discuss. The essay argues that our deepest moral convictions are often just post hoc rationalizations. I mean, the things we use to define our national character.
Yeah.
They're actually just the psychological traits that kept our ancestors from dying.
Okay, let's unpack this right out of the gate, because that is a massive claim. Are we really saying that what we proudly call our deeply held moral values, like, a strong work ethic or community, are actually just evolutionary survival strategies forced on us by the weather and dirt?
That is exactly the premise. Let's look at the historical mechanics of how this happens, starting with harsh climates. Think about what a severe pre-industrial winter actually demands of a human being.
I mean, a lot of shivering, mostly.
Well, yeah, but also long-term planning. You have to harvest and store enough food to survive months of frozen, barren landscapes. It requires intense cooperation within your group to share resources during absolute scarcity.
Right.
And above all, it requires a mastery of delayed gratification.
Because if you don't have those traits, you don't just have a difficult winter. You vanish from the gene pool.
Exactly.
Like if you eat all your seed grain in autumn because you lack delayed gratification, you starve in February.
Precisely. It is a brutal, unyielding biological filter. Over thousands of years, cold latitudes culled those with high time preference, meaning it's selected for individuals who value future security over immediate reward.
And a high trust radius.
Right. This evolutionary bottleneck birthed what Kunis refers to as the Nordic character. So when a modern Nordic society values consensus, long-term safety nets, and high trust, they aren't just making a philosophical choice, they are expressing a thermal adaptation.
A thermal adaptation.
Yeah.
Wow. So the cold literally forced us to cooperate to survive.
Yeah.
But what happens when you flip the map? Like what happens in a tropical environment where there is no winter bottleneck? Food is available year-round, but the environment is teeming with invisible threats.
This is where we look at the work of researchers Fincher and Thornhill on something called parasite stress. In a hot tropical environment, the selection pressure for delayed gratification is much lower.
Because the environment doesn't freeze over for 4 months?
Exactly. However, the selection pressure regarding pathogens is enormous. If you live in an environment with high disease prevalence, interacting with strangers is incredibly dangerous.
Because strangers carry novel pathogens that your physiological immune system has never encountered.
Right. So if your physical immune system can't protect you from a new disease, your brain has to step in. Fincher and Thornhill call this behavioral immunity.
Behavioral immunity, okay.
Yeah, natural selection favored populations that developed a smaller trust radius and a much stronger preference for their in-group. They became inherently suspicious of outsiders and highly conformist to local traditions.
Just because traditional ways of preparing food and managing hygiene were proven to keep them alive.
Exactly. Conformity was quite literally a survival mechanism.
Let me stop and connect this for the listener because the
Yeah.
modern implications of this are staggering.
Right.
Are you saying that things like contemporary xenophobia or deep political divides or a culture's general openness to foreigners might actually be rooted in the historical prevalence of infectious diseases in their region?
The data strongly supports that connection, yeah. High parasite regions globally show significantly higher collectivism, much stronger family ties, and lower generalized trust towards strangers.
That is wild.
It really is. Pathogen prevalence literally predicts collectivism across almost 200 pre-industrial societies. And we still see the echoes of that behavioral immunity in modern nation states today.
So climate and disease shape our baseline hardware. But how we literally pull our food out of the dirt seems to rewrite that software even further. Let's talk about the agricultural mode, specifically Telhelm's rice theory, which we hinted at in the intro.
Yeah, Thomas Talhelm looked at China and noticed a stark psychological divide between the North and the South. And he traced this back to the staple crops they farmed.
Right, the rice paddies versus wheat fields.
Exactly. Rice paddies require standing water, which means massive, coordinated irrigation networks. Farmers have to meticulously cooperate to manage the water flow across different properties.
Because one farmer floods their field at the wrong time, it ruins the neighbor's crops too.
Right, it forces interdependence.
It sounds like rice farming is the ultimate high-stakes group project, where if one person slacks, everyone fails the class. So you must care about group harmony. But wheat farming, which dominated the North, is a completely solo gig.
Yeah, with wheat, you rely on rainfall, not shared irrigation. You succeed or fail entirely on your own. And interdependence in physical survival creates interdependence in cognition.
And we can still measure this today.
We can. Today, residents of historically rice farming regions in China show more holistic thinking, stronger interdependence, and more relational reasoning than those from wheat farming regions. And this holds true even when researchers control for modern wealth and urbanization.
So the ghost of the agricultural environment is still dictating how people process information. I mean, that's fascinating. But I want to push back on this a bit, or at least explore the limits of it. How long does this actually take?
What do you mean?
Well, we're talking about psychological shifts over centuries, but how does this translate into macroeconomic history, like the massive wealth divergence we saw in Europe?
Ah, okay. To understand that, we have to look at the mechanism of differential reproduction. And to explain that, we need to quickly define the Malthusian trap, which governed almost all of human history up until the 1800s.
Right. For the listener who might not be familiar with that term, a Malthusian trap basically means that anytime a pre-industrial society invented better farming techniques and grew a surplus of food, they didn't actually get richer. They just had more children.
And then the population spiked, ate up all the extra food, and everyone went right back to living at the edge of starvation.
Exactly. It's a bleak cycle.
It is. Now, within that brutal Malthusian reality, economic historian Gregory Clark analyzed records from medieval England between the years 1200 and 1800. He found that during this period, the wealthy consistently out-reproduced the poor.
Meaning more of their kids survived.
Yes. If you were a successful merchant or a large landowner, more of your children survived to adulthood. If you were a poor laborer, your genetic line frequently died out.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following the causality here. If the rich are having more surviving children, those children inevitably have to move down the social ladder because there isn't enough wealth for all of them to stay at the top.
Yes, downward social mobility. But as they moved down, they took their psychological traits with them. Clark observed that over 600 years, national interest rates plummeted, literacy rose, and work hours increased.
And why did interest rates fall?
Because interest rates are essentially a measure of a society's time preference. High rates mean people demand immediate reward. Low rates mean they are willing to wait.
So because the people who had patience, diligence, and a strong work ethic, what we call bourgeois values, were the ones having the most surviving children, those specific behavioral traits slowly filtered down.
Exactly. They spread through the entire population. It was a long, slow biological and cultural filtering process. The Industrial Revolution didn't just happen because someone invented a steam engine.
Right. It wasn't just a tech upgrade.
No, it happened because the population of England had been systematically shaped over centuries to exhibit the exact psychological traits required to sustain complex, long-term economic growth.
That reframes so much of what we assume is just standard human nature.
Yeah.
And it leads perfectly into Joseph Hendrick's work on weird psychology.
Yes, WEIRD is an acronym for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. Henrich's research is a massive wake-up call to the field of psychology.
Because for decades, psychology just assumed that the way American college students thought was the way all humans thought, right?
Pretty much. Henrich proved that Western individualistic psychology is not a human universal. It is actually a bizarre historical anomaly.
Because things like defining yourself by your personal career rather than your family lineage, or trusting anonymous strangers in business transactions, these are incredibly rare traits globally.
They are. And Henrich traces the origin of this bizarre psychology back to the medieval Catholic Church.
Wait, really? The Catholic Church?
Yeah. The Church implemented strict marriage policies that aggressively banned cousin marriage and polygamy. By doing this, they systematically dismantled the complex, extended kin networks that had organized human society for millennia.
So if you can't rely on your massive extended clan for protection in business, because the church forced you to marry outside your tribe, you suddenly have to learn how to form voluntary associations.
Exactly. You have to build guilds, universities, and cities based on shared interests rather than shared blood.
Yeah.
You're forced to build generalized trust.
Wow. So the church altered the social environment, which created a new selection pressure, which birthed the weird psychology that ultimately built the modern Western world.
Spot on. It's all connected.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on the hardware. The environment, through climate, disease, agriculture, and history, has written the source code of our brains. But now we need to look at what happens when these different populations try to build modern societies.
Right, this is where Kunis talks about the software, our institutions.
Yeah, and the core rule here is that you cannot install arbitrary software on arbitrary hardware. Institutions aren't magic spells you can cast over any population.
No, they aren't. An institution assumes a specific psychological substrate. A democratic constitution assumes high generalized trust. Strict property rights assume a population with low time preference that cares about long-term investment.
Kunis brings up the historical example of Liberia, which I think illustrates this perfectly. They essentially copied the United States Constitution almost word for word.
But it didn't produce an American society.
It couldn't, because the psychological substrate of the population in Liberia had been shaped by entirely different environmental pressures.
Exactly. Tropical climates, higher pathogen stress, strong kin networks. When the institutional software doesn't match the psychological hardware of the people, you end up with what Kunis calls cargo cult governance.
Cargo cult governance. Let's clarify that for the listener. It basically means you have the superficial aesthetics of a system. You have a parliament building, judges in robes, written laws, but none of it functions as intended.
Right, because the formal institutions inevitably get captured by the informal psychology. If your survival adaptation for thousands of years was to prioritize your extended family above all else, you are going to use the machinery of the modern state to enrich your family.
So what a Western institution calls corruption, a kin-based psychology calls moral loyalty to your cousins.
Precisely. It's a completely different moral framework based on survival.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you're listening to this and thinking about the last 20 years of Western foreign policy, like the trillions spent trying to install American-style democracy in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, this explains exactly why it fails.
You can't just copy-paste democratic software onto completely different evolutionary hardware. This brings up the distinction between how different substrates must be governed. Let's look at a high-trust substrate, like the Nordic countries.
The ones shaped by those brutal winter bottlenecks we discussed.
Right. They can operate on what Kunis calls vibes governance.
Vibes governance. I have to admit, I chuckled at that term in the essay. But it makes perfect sense. It means they don't need 1,000 pages of explicit rules for every minor interaction.
Yeah, because they share deep psychological priors, they naturally converge on similar interpretations of implicit norms. They assume the village.
But low trust or highly diverse substrates require explicit governance, right? Where people do not share those evolutionary priors.
Singapore is the prime example of that. You need strict written rules, clear hierarchies, and formal enforcement because you are building an architecture that assumes everyone is a stranger.
This actually blows a hole in one of the most famous debates in academic economics.
Yeah.
On one side, you have Jared Diamond, who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, arguing that physical geography determines a society's destiny.
And on the other side, Darren Acemoglu, who wrote Why Nations Fail, arguing that man-made institutions are all that matter.
Right, but Kunis argues they are both missing the critical middle layer.
Exactly. Diamond stops at geography, Acemoglu starts at institutions. The reality is that geography sets the selection pressure, which shapes the human psychology. And it is that psychology that dictates which institutions can actually survive without collapsing into corruption.
But let me challenge this because it sounds incredibly fatalistic.
Mm.
If institutions absolutely must match the psychological substrate, does that mean exporting development policies or democratic model to different cultures is just doomed to be a cargo cult? Are some places just doomed by their dirt?
Well, it doesn't mean they are doomed, but it means the development models require an exact, realistic match. You cannot take a Nordic welfare state, which relies on profound social trust and implicit guilt, and drop it into a region shaped by high pathogen stress and strong kin loyalty.
They just won't run.
It won't. If you want to build functional institutions in a low-trust region, you cannot rely on high-trust assumptions. You have to build explicit formal architecture that expects self-interest and strictly audits it. You have to play the hand the environment dealt you.
And it isn't just about the climate or the germs, is it? The essay points out that a society's trajectory is profoundly shaped by what natural resources it possesses and exactly where it sits on the map relative to its neighbors.
Yes. Kunis calls these endowments and strategic overlays. Let's start with endowments. Having zero natural resources, like in Singapore, Venice, or Hong Kong, creates a very clear evolutionary constraint: trade or die.
Because you have no agricultural hinterland. You have no oil.
Right. If you don't provide value to the outside world immediately, you starve. That total lack of a safety net selects for extreme pragmatism, rigorous meritocracy, and highly competent state capacity. There is zero margin for error.
And on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, you have high endowment regions, like the Gulf states.
Where the oil wealth is so massive that they become pure distribution states, they don't need rigorous, complex institutional competence to survive because the wealth literally just flows out of the ground.
But the most dangerous place to be, according to the essay, is stuck right in the middle, the medium endowment trap.
This is a brilliant expansion of the classic resource curse. Think of places like historical Argentina or Finland. They have enough resources, like vast forests, fertile soil, or minerals, to provide a comfortable baseline of living.
But not enough to be infinitely wealthy without effort.
Exactly.
So it's basically the geopolitical equivalent of a middle-class trust fund kid. You've got just enough of a safety net to not hustle desperately, but not enough wealth to just relax forever. You get stuck in the middle.
That analogy is spot on. A medium endowment permits a good enough orientation. The culture becomes very efficient at extracting low-complexity value like cutting down timber or growing soybeans, but they struggle immensely to innovate.
They just can't transition to high-complexity value creation like advanced technology or global finance.
Right. They aren't poor enough to feel the existential terror of Singapore, but they aren't rich enough to ignore the future.
And then there is the map itself, the strategic overlays, because who your neighbors are shapes your psychology just as much as your resources. The essay contrasts border states, island states, and hub states.
Yeah, if you are a border state, like Poland squeezed between Germany and Russia or Finland bordering Russia, your environment is defined by vulnerability. Any internal division in your society is an invitation for a massive neighbor to invade.
So that environmental terror selects for strategic harmlessness.
Exactly. The society develops a deep consensus culture, suppresses visible ambition that might rock the boat, and builds emergency override mechanisms into their politics.
Compare that to an island state, like England or Japan. Because they are geographically isolated by water, they have a massive buffer.
And that buffer changes everything. England could fight brutal, decades-long civil wars that would have instantly resulted in a border state like Poland being partitioned and erased from the map.
Wow. Geographic isolation permits internal diversity, loud debate, and conflict without existential risk.
Exactly. And finally, you have hub states like historical Amsterdam or Constantinople. They sit at the crossroads of global trade. To survive there, you must engage with strangers constantly. That selects for high tolerance, fluid deal-making, and a merchant psychology over a warrior psychology.
It's mesmerizing how all these interlocking pieces, winter, parasites, rice, reproduction, cousin marriage, oil, oceans, have spent thousands of years silently writing the source code of human behavior. But here is the ultimate twist that brings us to the present day.
And this is where it gets a little unsettling.
Yeah. What happens to all of this carefully evolved psychological hardware when the modern world suddenly removes the environmental threats that built it?
This is where Kunis shifts from historical analysis to a diagnosis of our current era. The environmental author has essentially put down the pen.
Because modern abundance changed everything. Central heating killed the winter bottleneck, medicine killed disease burdens, Welfare states killed mass starvation.
The things that ruthlessly culled our ancestors are just gone, and this triggers a crisis. When environmental selection pressure lifts, biological and cultural adaptation stops.
The behaviors that were maintained purely because lacking them meant freezing or starving are now maintained by nothing.
Right, so they begin to drift. Kunis calls this the axiological Malthusian trap.
Let's make sure that's clear. Axiology is the philosophical study of values. So an axiological Malthusian trap means that just as unchecked population growth used to eat up our physical resources, unchecked comfort now eats up our psychological resources.
Our values decay because they aren't being tested. Look at time preference. Low time preference used to be a literal survival mandate. Work hard all summer and save for winter, or you will die.
But when the threat of winter is conquered by abundance, that low time preference mutates.
Yes, it rots into merely preserving the comfortable status quo. We stop building for the future and start obsessing over not losing what we currently have. It becomes a recipe for societal stagnation.
He also points to how the instinct for cooperation becomes corrupted, doesn't he?
He does. When a collective society no longer faces a lethal external threat, the instinct to cooperate reorients inward. It degrades from, we must work together to survive the harsh world, into, we insiders must form a cartel to keep outsiders from accessing our resources.
So cooperation literally turns into rent-seeking. This leads to the concept of cultural hysteresis. Our technology has updated incredibly fast, but our culture updates at a glacial pace. Kunis writes that we are essentially tropical animals living in heated buildings, but we are still fighting phantom winters.
A phantom winter. Our cultural software is still preaching delayed gratification, extreme consensus building, and territorial defense for a cold, brutal season that modern technology abolished generations ago.
We are holding on to zombie adaptations.
We really are. We have political systems designed to require absolute consensus because, in the past, division meant invasion. But today, that same consensus requirement just paralyzes necessary reforms.
We are hoarding grain for a winter that won't come, while the house is burning from completely different modern fires, which naturally makes you wonder, can we fake it?
You mean artificial selection?
Yeah. If the real physical environment has stopped culling us, can a society manufacture an artificial selection pressure to keep everyone sharp and competent?
Well, Singapore tries this. The ruling party actively attempts to maintain artificial pressure through relentless messaging. The narrative pushed on the population is constantly, we are 5 minutes from death, or we have absolutely no margin for error in a hostile world.
Even though they are incredibly wealthy.
Right. They are trying to simulate the anxiety of a trade-or-die environment in a wealthy, modern population that hasn't seen real starvation in decades.
But does a simulated threat actually work to maintain the psychology?
Partially. I mean, Singapore does maintain remarkably high state capacity, far higher than most wealthy post-selection societies, but their fertility rate has collapsed below replacement levels.
Suggesting that artificial pressure is ultimately an incomplete substitute for real environmental constraints.
Exactly. You can contrast that with Israel, which maintains exceptionally high innovation, state capacity, and higher fertility than comparably wealthy nations. But Israel's pressure isn't a narrative. It's a real, perpetual external threat.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now? If the old environment of brutal winters and lethal pathogens is gone, and we're just exhausting ourselves fighting phantom winters, what is the new environment shaping our survival today?
The final piece of Kunis's argument is that the digital environment is the new winter. The internet, artificial intelligence, and frictionless global capital flows are the new selection pressures, and they select for an entirely different set of traits.
The old physical world we've been talking about selected for centralization. It favored massive factories, large standing armies, and strict territorial defense.
But the digital environment actively punishes those traits. It selects for extreme decentralization, rapid agility, and the ability to attract global talent. Jurisdictions that try to treat the internet like a physical forest, as something they can fence in, control, and regulate with permission-based bureaucratic models, will fail.
They are actively maladapting to the new environment. Because in a networked world, high-agency people don't have to stay in bad systems. They aren't trapped on the farm anymore.
Exactly. Capital and talent will simply route around archaic, centralized friction. They will migrate to jurisdictions that fundamentally understand network logic.
As we wrap up this deep dive, the most profound takeaway for you, the listener, is a total shift in how we view the world around us. When you encounter a different culture or even a different political faction, and their values clash completely with yours, You aren't looking at different moral choices.
No, you are looking at different psychologies built by entirely different survival pressures over thousands of years.
Right. Judging someone else's cultural values is as pointless as morally judging the climate. Understanding that the environment is the author builds immense empathy and immense clarity.
It really changes your entire analytical framework. You stop asking, why are these people choosing to be so rigid or so corrupt or so individualistic? And you start asking, what specific historical and environmental constraints made this exact behavior a survival requirement?
And it leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to ponder based on the source text. The concept of competitive federalism like in Switzerland, where different cantons compete for citizens. In this new digital winter where remote work and capital flow freely, high agency people will simply migrate away from bad institutional software. So ask yourself, as governments are forced to compete for you based on their ability to adapt to network logic, what will happen to the territorially intact but digitally relevant backwaters left behind? What happens to the places that try to enforce strict physical world written laws on a new environment that operates on digital good vibes? We'll leave you to think on that.